October 28, 1962. Fidel Castro was in the Soviet embassy in Havana, chain-smoking cigars and pacing like a caged animal, when the call came through from Moscow. It was late morning and Castro had barely slept in days. The world was on the brink of nuclear war, and Cuba, his Cuba, the small island nation that had dared to defy the American empire, was at the center of it all. For 13 days, the crisis had been building. American spy planes had discovered Soviet nuclear missiles on Cuban soil. President Kennedy had imposed a naval blockade around Cuba, calling it a quarantine to avoid the word that would make war inevitable. Soviet ships carrying more missiles had steamed toward the blockade, and for a terrifying moment it had seemed they would try to break through, triggering a confrontation that could escalate to nuclear war. But then Khrushchev had blinked. The Soviet ships had turned back. And now, this morning, Radio Moscow had broadcast a message from Khrushchev to Kennedy. The Soviet Union would remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for an American promise not to invade the island. Castro had heard the broadcast. He had listened in disbelief, then rage, as Khrushchev, without consulting him, without even informing him in advance, had agreed to withdraw the missiles that were supposed to protect Cuba from American invasion. And now the Soviet ambassador to Cuba, Alexander Alexeyev, was on the phone from Moscow, trying to explain Khrushchev's decision. Castro grabbed the phone from the embassy official who had answered it. "Alexeyev, what the hell is Khrushchev doing? He's surrendering. He's giving in to American blackmail." Alexeyev's voice came through, tinny and distant over the transatlantic line. "Comrade Fidel, please understand. Premier Khrushchev had no choice. The Americans were preparing to invade Cuba. They were preparing airstrikes. We were on the edge of nuclear war. Khrushchev had to find a way to step back from the brink." "By betraying Cuba," Castro shouted into the phone. "By removing our defenses without even asking us. By treating us like children who don't get a say in our own fate?" "Comrade Fidel," Alexeyev said carefully, "the missiles were Soviet missiles, operated by Soviet personnel. The decision about their deployment and removal was ultimately a Soviet decision." Castro's face flushed with anger. Soviet missiles on Cuban soil, missiles that were supposed to protect Cuba from American aggression, and now Khrushchev is taking them away, leaving us defenseless, and we don't even get consulted. He took a deep breath, trying to control his rage. What guarantees did Khrushchev get? What did Kennedy promise in exchange for the missiles? "Kennedy has promised not to invade Cuba," Alexeyev said. "It's a public commitment. The Americans won't attack." "A promise," Castro spat. "An American promise. And we're supposed to trust that. The same Americans who organized the Bay of Pigs invasion just last year. The same Americans who have been trying to assassinate me. The same Americans who have been sabotaging our economy and supporting counter-revolutionaries. We're supposed to trust their promise." "Comrade Fidel." "No," Castro interrupted. "I need to speak to Khrushchev directly. Get me a call with him, now." "That may take some time to arrange," Alexeyev said. "The Premier is in meetings." "I don't care if he's meeting with God himself," Castro roared. "Get him on the phone. Tell him Fidel Castro demands to speak with him. Tell him that if he's going to betray Cuba, he can at least have the courage to tell me himself." After slamming down the phone, Castro continued pacing around the embassy, smoking furiously, his mind racing. Around him, Cuban officials and Soviet advisors watched nervously, unsure what to say or do. Everyone knew that Castro was furious, and when Castro was furious, he was unpredictable. Che Guevara, Castro's comrade from the revolution and now Minister of Industries, was sitting in a corner of the room watching Castro pace. Finally, he spoke up. "Fidel, maybe we should think about this more carefully. Khrushchev may have saved us from an American invasion. Kennedy was ready to attack. The intelligence reports were clear. If Khrushchev hadn't made this deal, we might be fighting an American invasion right now." Castro whirled on Che, his eyes blazing. You think I'm afraid of an American invasion? We've been preparing for this. We have hundreds of thousands of militia ready to fight. We would have turned Cuba into another Vietnam for the Americans. They would have drowned in Cuban blood before they conquered this island. And what about nuclear war? Che asked quietly. If the Americans had invaded, the Soviets might have used the tactical nuclear weapons they have here, and then the Americans would have responded with their nuclear weapons. And then Moscow and Washington would have started firing ICBMs at each other. The whole world would have burned Fidel. Is that what you wanted? Castro stopped pacing and looked at Che. For a moment, his expression softened slightly. I wanted Cuba to be defended. I wanted the revolution to be protected. I wanted the Americans to know that if they attacked us, there would be consequences. Terrible consequences. He sat down heavily in a chair, suddenly looking exhausted. Do you know what I did 2 days ago, Che? On October 26th, when it looked like the Americans were about to invade. Che shook his head. I wrote a letter to Khrushchev, Castro said quietly. I told him that if the Americans invaded Cuba, if it looked like they were going to destroy the revolution, then the Soviet Union should launch a nuclear first strike against the United States. I told him that Cuba was willing to sacrifice itself, to be destroyed if it meant taking the imperialists down with us. The room fell silent. Everyone stared at Castro, shocked. Even Che, who had fought alongside Castro in the mountains, who had seen him make bold and dangerous decisions before, looked stunned. You told Khrushchev to start a nuclear war? Che asked slowly. I told him that if Cuba was going to die, we should die fighting, and we should take the enemy with us, Castro said. I told him that the survival of socialism was more important than the survival of Cuba, or the Soviet Union, or even human civilization. That we should be willing to sacrifice everything rather than let imperialism win. He laughed bitterly. And you know what Khrushchev did? He ignored me. He made his deal with Kennedy. He chose survival over principle. He chose compromise over confrontation. He chose to save the world rather than defend the revolution. Che was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Maybe that was the right choice, Fidel. Castro looked at him sharply. What? Maybe Khrushchev was right, Che said carefully. Maybe preserving human civilization is more important than defending revolutionary pride. Maybe living to fight another day is better than dying in nuclear fire. You sound like a coward, Castro said coldly. No, Che replied, his voice steady. I sound like someone who understands that dead revolutionaries can't make revolution. If Cuba had been destroyed in a nuclear war, if the world had been destroyed, then what would we have accomplished? We would have died heroically, yes, but we would still be dead, and the revolution would be dead with us. Before Castro could respond, the phone rang again. An embassy official answered, then turned to Castro. Comrade Fidel, it's Premier Khrushchev. He's calling from Moscow. Castro stubbed out his cigar and picked up the phone. Khrushchev. Comrade Fidel, Khrushchev's voice came through, speaking in Russian. Castro's Russian was good enough to follow, though an interpreter stood by just in case. I understand you're upset about my decision. Upset, Castro said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. That's an interesting way to describe it. I would say I'm furious. I would say I feel betrayed. I would say that the Soviet Union has abandoned Cuba in our hour of greatest need. Comrade Fidel, Khrushchev said, his voice patient but firm, I did not abandon Cuba. I saved Cuba. The Americans were preparing to invade. They had troops ready, aircraft ready, ships ready. If I had not made this agreement with Kennedy, American forces would be landing on Cuban beaches right now. And we would have fought them, Castro shot back. We would have made them pay for every inch of Cuban soil. Yes, Khrushchev said. You would have fought, and you would have died. The Americans have overwhelming military superiority in the Caribbean. They could have crushed Cuban resistance in days or weeks. And then what? The revolution would be over. You would be dead or in exile, and Cuba would be back under American control. At least we would have died fighting. Castro said. At least we would have gone down with honor, rather than accepting American dictation. Honor? Khrushchev's voice took on an edge. Let me tell you about honor, Comrade Fidel. I received your letter, the one where you suggested that I launch a nuclear first strike against the United States if the Americans invaded Cuba. Do you have any idea what you were asking me to do? Castro was silent. You were asking me to start a nuclear war that would kill hundreds of millions of people. Khrushchev continued, his voice rising. You were asking me to destroy Soviet cities, American cities, European cities. You were asking me to end human civilization. And for what? For Cuban pride? For revolutionary glory? That's not honor, Comrade Fidel. That's madness. It's principle, Castro said stubbornly. It's refusing to surrender to imperialism. It's suicide, Khrushchev countered. And I'm not going to commit suicide, and I'm not going to destroy the world just to satisfy your revolutionary romanticism. I have a responsibility to the Soviet people, to the socialist world, to humanity itself. And that responsibility includes not starting a nuclear war, unless there's absolutely no other choice. So you chose to betray Cuba instead, Castro said bitterly. I chose to save Cuba. Khrushchev's voice was exasperated now. Don't you understand? Kennedy has promised not to invade. You have a guarantee of Cuban sovereignty. The revolution is safe. You can continue building socialism in Cuba without fear of American invasion. That's what I achieved for you. A promise from Kennedy, Castro said scornfully. An American promise. And you expect me to be grateful? Yes, Khrushchev said flatly. Because that American promise, backed by the threat of Soviet retaliation if it's broken, is the best protection Cuba has. It's better than missiles that would have made you a target in a nuclear war. It's better than fighting an invasion you couldn't win. It's better than dying heroically but pointlessly. There was a long silence on the line. Castro took a deep breath, trying to control his emotions. Finally, he said, You should have consulted me. Before you made the deal with Kennedy, you should have talked to me. Cuba isn't a Soviet colony. We're a sovereign nation. We deserve to be part of the decision. Khrushchev's voice softened slightly. You're right. I should have consulted you. But there wasn't time, Comrade Fidel. The situation was moving too fast. Kennedy needed an answer quickly, or he was going to order an invasion. I had to make a decision, and I made the one I thought would save Cuba and prevent nuclear war. Without asking Cuba, Castro repeated. Without asking Cuba, Khrushchev admitted, and for that I apologize. But I don't apologize for the decision itself. It was the right decision, and in time, I think you'll come to see that. After the call ended, Castro sat in silence for a long time, staring at nothing. The other people in the room waited, unsure what to say or do. Finally, Castro stood up and walked to the window looking out over Havana. It was a beautiful day. The sun was shining, the sky was blue, the city looked peaceful. Hard to believe that just hours ago, the world had been on the brink of nuclear annihilation. He's wrong, Castro said quietly, not turning around. Khrushchev is wrong. We shouldn't have backed down. We shouldn't have accepted American terms. We should have been willing to fight, to die if necessary, rather than surrender. But even as he said it, Castro knew that Khrushchev had been right about one thing. Cuba couldn't have won a war against the United States, not militarily. The Americans were too strong, too close, too determined. If it had come to invasion, Cuba would have fought bravely, but Cuba would have lost. And yet, accepting that reality felt like betrayal. Castro had spent his entire adult life fighting against American imperialism, against the idea that small nations had to bow to great powers, against the notion that might makes right. The revolution had been about defying the odds, about standing up to overwhelming force, about refusing to accept that Cuba's fate should be determined by Washington. And now, Khrushchev had made a deal with Kennedy over Cuba's head. The two superpowers had decided Cuba's fate between themselves, and Cuba, the country whose survival was at stake, had been treated as a pawn in their game. Che came to stand beside Castro at the window. "What are you going to do, Fidel?" Castro was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm going to make sure this never happens again. I'm going to make sure that Cuba never again has to depend on Soviet protection, or Soviet missiles, or Soviet decisions. We're going to build our own defense, our own economy, our own path to socialism. And we're never going to let anyone, not the Americans, not the Soviets, not anyone, treat us like we're too small or too weak to control our own destiny." "That's going to be difficult," Che said. "We're a small island. We don't have nuclear weapons. We don't have the economic or military power to stand alone against the United States." "Then we'll build that power," Castro said. "However long it takes. We'll mobilize every Cuban. We'll sacrifice whatever we have to sacrifice, but we'll be truly independent, not dependent on Soviet missiles or American mercy or anyone else's decisions." Over the following days, Castro's anger at Khrushchev and the Soviets became more public. He gave speeches criticizing the Soviet decision, complaining that Cuba hadn't been consulted, insisting that Cuba would have been willing to fight rather than accept American terms. He refused to allow UN inspectors to verify the removal of the missiles, asserting Cuban sovereignty. He made it clear that while Cuba remained allied with the Soviet Union, Cuba was not a Soviet puppet. The Soviets were irritated by Castro's defiance, but they also understood it. Cuba had been through a traumatic experience, threatened with invasion, brought to the brink of destruction, then saved by a deal made without Cuban input. Castro's anger was understandable, even if his suggestion of nuclear first strike had been reckless and dangerous. In Moscow, Khrushchev reflected on the crisis and on Castro's reaction. In a meeting with his advisors, he said, "Castro is young. He's inexperienced in international affairs, and he's too willing to risk everything for revolutionary glory. He wanted me to start a nuclear war to defend Cuba. Can you imagine? He was willing to see Cuba destroyed, the Soviet Union destroyed, the whole world destroyed, rather than accept a compromise." One of his advisors asked, "Do you think he's unstable? Should we reconsider our support for Cuba?" Khrushchev shook his head. "No, he's not unstable. He's a revolutionary, and revolutionaries think differently than we do. They're willing to take risks that seem insane to us. That's what makes them effective at overthrowing old regimes. But it also makes them dangerous when they have access to nuclear weapons." He paused. "That's why I made the decision I did. Not just to avoid war with America, but because I realized that if I left those missiles in Cuba under Castro's influence, there was a real risk he might pressure us to use them. And I'm not going to let anyone, not Castro, not anyone, push me into starting a nuclear war." Years later, historians would debate the Cuban Missile Crisis endlessly. Was Khrushchev right to back down? Did Kennedy's firmness prevent war, or did his initial deployment of missiles to Turkey provoke the crisis? What would have happened if the Soviets had refused to remove the missiles? But one of the most controversial revelations came decades after the crisis, when Soviet and American archives were opened and participants began speaking more freely. It turned out that Castro had indeed written to Khrushchev, urging a nuclear first strike if the Americans invaded. And it also turned out that Soviet forces in Cuba had tactical nuclear weapons and authorization to use them if communications with Moscow were cut off, and an American invasion seemed imminent. In other words, the world had been even closer to nuclear war than anyone realized at the time. If Kennedy had ordered an invasion, Soviet commanders in Cuba might have used tactical nuclear weapons against American forces. And then the crisis would have escalated beyond anyone's control. In a 1992 conference in Havana, where veterans of the crisis gathered to discuss what had happened, Castro was confronted with his letter to Khrushchev urging nuclear first strike. "Did you really tell Khrushchev to launch nuclear weapons?" an American participant asked. Castro, now an old man with a gray beard but still defiant, nodded. Yes, I believed then, and I still believe, that if imperialism was going to destroy the Cuban Revolution, we should take imperialism down with us. That socialism was worth fighting for, worth dying for, worth destroying the world for if necessary. The room fell silent, shocked. Even the Cuban participants looked uncomfortable. Robert McNamara, who had been Kennedy's Secretary of Defense during the crisis, spoke up. "Mr. Castro, do you realize what you're saying? You were willing to see nuclear war, willing to see millions of people die, including Cubans, rather than accept a compromise?" Castro looked at McNamara steadily. "Yes, because I believe the alternative was the destruction of the revolution, the return of American imperialism, the end of everything we had fought for. And I believe that was unacceptable. But the compromise saved Cuba," McNamara said. "Kennedy's promise not to invade has held for 30 years. The revolution survived. You're still in power. Doesn't that prove Khrushchev was right?" Castro was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Perhaps Khrushchev was right to choose survival over principle. But at the time, I couldn't see it that way. At the time, I felt betrayed, abandoned, treated like a pawn in a game between superpowers." He paused. "And I still believe that Khrushchev should have consulted me before making the deal. Cuba's fate was at stake. We deserved to be part of the decision." Back in October 1962, in the immediate aftermath of Khrushchev's decision to remove the missiles, Castro's anger had been raw and intense. He had paced the Soviet embassy in Havana, chain-smoking, raging at the betrayal, at the humiliation, at the fact that Cuba's fate had been decided by others. But even in his anger, part of Castro understood what Che had said, that dead revolutionaries can't make revolution, that Cuba surviving to fight another day was better than Cuba dying heroically but pointlessly in nuclear fire. And so, after days of fury and defiance, Castro had finally accepted the reality. The missiles were gone. Kennedy had promised not to invade. Cuba would survive, but on terms dictated by the superpowers, not by Cuba itself. Standing at the window of the Soviet embassy, looking out over Havana, Castro had made himself a promise. Never again. Never again would Cuba's fate be decided by others. Never again would Cuba be a pawn in someone else's game. Never again would Cuba have to depend on Soviet missiles or American mercy. Cuba would stand alone if necessary. Cuba would build its own defense, its own economy, its own path. Cuba would be truly independent, truly sovereign, truly free to make its own decisions. It would take decades. It would require enormous sacrifice. It would mean enduring American embargo, Soviet manipulation, economic hardship, international isolation. But Cuba would endure. Cuba would survive. Cuba would prove that a small nation could defy superpowers and maintain its independence. That was what Fidel Castro said to himself when Khrushchev canceled the nuclear launch on Cuba. Not out loud, not in any speech or statement, but in his heart, in his mind, in his revolutionary soul. "You've saved us today, Khrushchev. You've saved Cuba from destruction, but you've also shown me that we can't depend on you, can't trust you to defend us, can't accept being treated as your satellite. So I thank you for saving us, and I promise you that Cuba will never again need saving, because we'll save ourselves."